No radio, no working field phones. Maps, useless. A German battalion with armor was already moving to crush a vital supply road. In that frozen forest, one mistake meant annihilation. Any shout could give away their position. Any flare would draw German fire. The company commander had no way to control his flanks. And then, in the middle of this blackout, a young lieutenant did something that looked completely insane. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, cheap wooden flute. The men had laughed at it for weeks. They called him the musician, not an officer. They said toys don't belong at the front. But that night, when every radio fell silent and the Germans were already marching into the trees, that toy suddenly became the only functioning communication system on the battlefield. 3 short patterns of notes, no longer a joke, but a secret language. One signal froze 120 men in perfect silence just meters from German scouts. Another moved hidden scouts behind the enemy column without a single shouted order. A final rising sequence unleashed a perfectly synchronized 3-sided ambush, turning a German advance into a slaughterhouse. By dawn, the road was saved, the battalion was broken, and the same soldiers who mocked the flute as childish swore that they had survived because one man turned sound into a weapon. This is the story of Lieutenant Alexei Sokolov, the officer whose children's flute trapped a German battalion in a forest no map could save. Lieutenant Alexei Sokolov arrived at the front in the winter of 1943. He was 23, tall, thin, with tired but clear eyes and a strange habit. He always kept a plain wooden flute, more like a shepherd's whistle than a real instrument, in the inside pocket of his tunic. His new comrades noticed it immediately. In the dugout, while others checked weapons or tried to sleep, he would sit by the entrance, turning the flute in his hands. Sometimes, very quietly, he played short fragments of melody, just a few notes, never a full song. To the regular infantrymen, this looked ridiculous. "Hey, musician," they joked, "you going to play for the Germans?" "Comrade Lieutenant, the orchestra's that way. Wrong front." One sergeant, a frontline veteran, would shake his head. War is about bullets and steel, not fairy tales and toys. At first, Sokolov did not answer. He simply listened. In the trenches, in the forest, in the ruins of villages, he noticed something most men ignored: sound. The crunch of boots in snow, the particular crack of a breaking branch, the hollow echo of a shouted order in a ravine, the metallic rattle of a German MG-42 compared to a Soviet DP light machine gun. Sound traveled differently at night, over frozen ground, through pines or through open fields, and sound could be controlled. Before the war, Alexei was not a musician by profession. He had studied mathematics and physics at a technical institute. His father, a quiet village teacher, had given him the wooden flute when he was a boy. Alexei learned simple tunes by ear, but never went beyond that. The flute was a memory, not a career. Yet his mathematical mind did something unusual with that memory. He started hearing not music, but patterns. One night, while his company lay in wet dugouts after a failed attack, Alexei and the company commander, Captain Grigoriev, shared a small lantern and a map that was already out of date. The captain cursed under his breath. The enemy positions had changed, forest lines burned down, old landmarks destroyed. Communication lines were unreliable. Every attempt to coordinate flanking attacks with neighboring units had turned into chaos. "We lost 3rd Platoon yesterday because they couldn't hear the signal flare from the right flank," the captain said quietly. Wind, smoke, gunfire. It drowned everything. By the time they attacked, they were alone, and the Germans were ready. Alexei looked at the map, then at the darkness outside the dugout. "Comrade Captain," he said carefully, "what if our signals didn't depend on light, or on shouting, or on fragile wires?" The captain frowned. "Explain." Alexei pulled the flute from his pocket. "Sound carries far in this forest at night, but it needs to be distinct, not random shouting, not a whistle that sounds like the wind. Something with clear patterns, not music, code." The captain responded with irritation. "This is war, not a concert hall. You think the Germans will just sit and listen to your performance?" Alexei remained calm. Not performance, system. Notes as commands, short sequences, recognizable, repeatable. Different tones for left flank, right flank, withdrawal, advance, diversion. No need for light, no need for wires. And if we vary the patterns, the enemy will not immediately understand what they mean. Grigoriev drained his mug of tea and just stared. You want to run a combat operation with a flute? Alexei did not smile. I want to communicate when everything else is dead. Over the following weeks, the company saw brutal combat. Trenches changed hands. Positions were lost, then retaken. Radios failed from cold or shrapnel. Runners disappeared in shell craters. And slowly, very quietly, Alexei tested ideas. On short marches, he walked behind the column and played a sequence of 3 notes: high, low, high. He told only his platoon sergeants in advance. When you hear this pattern, quietly raise your fist and check your spacing. The rank and file thought he was just relieving tension with music. When the troops rested under trees, he stood at one end of the line and played 4 low notes, then paused, then repeated. He watched how far the sound reached. He moved around, testing direction, checking how wind affected clarity. A pattern emerged. In dense forest, a simple, sharply played tone carried better than a shout. Over open fields, the flute could be heard even farther, but only if the player faced slightly upward, letting the sound travel. He kept notes in a small, battered notebook, disguised as ordinary field scribbles. Distance, tree density, direction, wind, background noise. Next to each entry, combinations of notes. He talked to the company's signaler, a young corporal named Petrov. What range do we get from a field phone line? Alexei asked. If the line isn't cut, a couple of kilometers easily, Petrov said, but it's always cut. And your whistle, Alexei continued. Petrov blew the tin whistle on his chest. The shrill sound bounced around the trench. Half the forest hears that, he grinned. Exactly, Alexei replied. The enemy too, and they know what it means. With the flute, Alexei realized he had one advantage: ambiguity. To a stranger, it was just random notes. To his men, it could be orders. On a rare, quiet evening, he gathered several trusted NCOs in a shelter: the skeptical sergeant, a machine gun squad leader, the signaler Petrov, and a scout named Mikhail, who had sharp hearing and a cautious nature. Alexei laid the flute on a crate. Gentlemen, he said, we are going to build our own language. They laughed at first. The sergeant shook his head. Lieutenant, you are either a genius or completely insane. Maybe both, Alexei answered, but let's test which. He set simple rules: 4 basic commands first: halt and hold position, advance quietly, prepare to open fire, shift left or right. He assigned each a short, distinct pattern, no more than 3 to 5 notes. He made sure each pattern was rhythmically and tonally different so they would not be confused in stress. For halt, 2 short low notes in quick succession. For advance quietly, 1 short high note, a pause, then another high note. For prepare to fire, a descending sequence, high, medium, low. For shift flank, a rising sequence, low, medium, high. He repeated them until each man could hum them without thinking. Then they went outside. He placed the group at different distances, behind snow-covered bushes, among trees, behind small rises in the ground. He walked away, turned his back to them to simulate real conditions, and played each pattern in random order. One by one, the NCOs raised hands in acknowledgement, repeating out loud what they believed the command was. No one misunderstood. It was crude. It was primitive. But it worked. Over several days, they expanded the code. 2 patterns played in sequence could indicate more complex actions: advance on the right, hold on the left, prepare ambush, cover retreat, redirect machine gun fire. Of course, they kept it secret. They used it only on exercises and short patrols under low-risk conditions. To the company at large, the lieutenant was still just the one with the flute. When they backed away from German positions after a reconnaissance mission, and he played a short sequence, and the entire patrol stopped in perfect silence instead of stumbling forward, only then did a few men start to look at him differently. Mikhail, the scout, confessed one night, staring at the red glow of a cigarette. You know, Lieutenant, that thing of yours, it saved us. There was a German listening post ahead. We would have walked right into it if you hadn't stopped us. We can't shout halt out there. They would hear. But the flute, They thought it was just wind in the trees. The sergeant, still skeptical, grumbled. Fine. Play your children's flute. But if headquarters finds out we're using music instead of radio, they'll send all of us to a penal battalion. Alexei simply answered, I don't care what they call it, as long as my men stay alive. The system was not perfect. In heavy firefights, gunfire drowned the sound. In storms, wind scattered the notes. But at night, in silence before contact, it was powerful. No one yet knew how decisive it would become. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. In late winter, the company received a new mission. Reconnaissance reported a German battalion, infantry with light armor support, preparing to push through a forest corridor toward a critical supply road. If the Germans broke through, they could threaten the flank of several Soviet regiments and cut off ammunition and food to frontline units. The Soviet command ordered a blocking action. Captain Grigoriev's company, along with elements of another unit, had to move into that forest by night, take positions by dawn, and prevent the Germans from using the corridor. There were two problems immediately. First, the maps were outdated. What used to be dense forest was now burned-out stumps. What once were clearings were now shell craters filled with water and snow. Second, communications were a mess. The company had one working radio with limited range, two field telephones with unreliable wire, and overworked runners. Any sustained artillery barrage could cut them off from support completely. The order, however, was simple. Move fast, get into the forest before the Germans, set up an ambush, and hold. No excuses. In the makeshift command post, over a table of maps lit by a smoking lamp, Captain Grigoriev traced the German approach route with a pencil. They will come here, he said, pointing at a narrow stretch between two small hills. The road is to the east. This is the shortest way. If they control this line, they can strike along the road and tear through the rear. We cannot let them form in open ground. He looked up at his officers. We need an ambush, not just a wall of men waiting to be shelled. We must let them enter the forest, stretch out their column, then close the trap. He drew a crude horseshoe shape on the map, a classic bag formation. Left flank hidden on a rise among trees, right flank dug in along a shallow ravine. Machine guns positioned on small knolls, with overlapping fields of fire directed toward the center. Mortars ready to strike the rear of the German column once it entered the pocket. If we coordinate this, the captain said, we can smash them. But it depends on timing. If one flank opens fire too early, the Germans will turn back or fan out, and we lose the chance. If we wait too long, they reach the edge and break through. He tapped the radio. This will not be enough, not in that terrain. Silence hung in the room. The officers knew, once they went under the forest canopy, radio reception would worsen, wires would be vulnerable, and runners could get lost or killed. Lieutenant Sokolov leaned over the map. Comrade Captain, he said, we can plan for broken communication. We can bake that into the operation. How? Grigoriev asked. We can't shout between flanks. Alexei pointed to the drawn horseshoe. Here, he said, indicating the left flank where his platoon would be. And here, pointing at the right flank. The distance in the forest is within sound range at night, if we use the right signal. The captain raised an eyebrow. You mean your flute? Alexei did not flinch. Yes, we've already tested ranges. From this rise to that ravine, if I stand near this tree line and face east, they will hear at least 3 distinct note patterns, and the Germans will not recognize them as commands. One of the other lieutenants laughed nervously. So what? The entire battle will depend on your melodies? Alexei's answer was precise. No, the battle will depend on coordinated fire. The flute will only do what the radio cannot, tell different parts of the company. Wait, prepare, strike now. Grigoriev studied his face. You understand what happens if this fails, Sokolov? If your sound games don't work? If one side mishears or doesn't hear at all? Alexei answered without hesitation. Then you can write in your report that I was a fool who tried to fight with a toy. But at least we won't die because we assumed fragile equipment would save us. The captain sighed, then finally nodded. All right, use your system. But keep the key commands simple. No complicated concerts. You get 3 moments: when to freeze, when to ready, and when to attack. You miss any of those, we risk disaster. The plan was set. Alexei's platoon, along with a machine gun team, would take the left side of the horseshoe, dug in behind fallen trunks and snowbanks. On the right flank, another platoon, whose sergeant had already trained in the flute signals, would mirror them. In the center, in deeper concealment, scouts and anti-tank rifles would wait for the head of the German column to pass before blocking the exit. Mortar crews positioned farther back would strike only after confirmation, also via sound. On the last evening before the mission, Alexei walked along the trench, stopping at each squad. He stood just long enough to repeat key patterns and meanings with squad leaders. 2 low notes: halt, high pause high, advance quietly. High, medium, low, prepare to fire. Low, medium, high, shift or pivot. For the ambush itself, they added a special signal, a short sequence of 3 quickly rising notes, the final command to open fire with everything, from rifles to machine guns to grenades. No one outside the inner circle knew exactly what the patterns meant, but everyone knew, when they heard them, they were not to panic or improvise. They were to follow their immediate leader's motions. Night swallowed the forest as the company moved out. Snow crunched under boots and was quickly trampled into a dirty paste. Breath steamed in the air. Their world shrank to the man in front of them and the dark silhouettes of trees. At first, they moved by the weak light of shuttered lanterns and occasional dim flashlights, turned on only for a second at a time. The closer they got to enemy ground, the more the lights disappeared. Finally, only darkness remained. The radio crackled, then fell silent. Field telephone lines, hastily rolled out, caught on branches and stumps. At one point, there was an explosion in the distance, German artillery probing the road. The company had to hurry without breaking stealth. A runner slipped and crashed into a hidden ditch. Someone whispered curses, weapons clanked. Then, almost at the same time, they heard it. The distant, muffled growl of engines and metal clattering. German vehicles moving somewhere beyond the tree line. Time was running out. The company spread out into their planned positions. Officers and NCOs roughly aligned on their landmarks. The burned tree stump here, the large boulder there, a crooked fir at the top of the rise. But in the chaotic forest, reality never matched maps perfectly. Some squads drifted too far left, others too far right. The horseshoe shape risked becoming a broken line. Without coordination, the bag could easily become an open corridor. And then, the worst happened. The radio collapsed, static, half sentences, then nothing. The field phone, stretched along the ground to the left flank, went dead soon after. The wire probably snapped under a falling branch or was cut by stray shrapnel. Captain Grigoriev, in the rough center of the formation, pressed the useless radio handset to his ear and realized, for the next hours, his company was effectively blind and deaf to each other. He could rely only on previously agreed timing and on one strange element of the plan: a young lieutenant with a flute. The Germans were coming. The sound grew clearer now, boots on frozen ground, gear rattling, low voices speaking in clipped, harsh syllables. Somewhere, a man coughed. The creak of wagon wheels, the metallic track noise of light armor. The forest, moments ago thick with silence, now held a living, moving presence beyond the tree line. In the left flank position, behind fallen logs, Lieutenant Sokolov pressed his cheek to the cold wood of his rifle, peering through a narrow gap. Next to him lay his flute, wrapped in cloth to dampen any accidental knock. Scouts crawled back from the forward listening posts. "They're coming," one whispered, barely moving his lips. "Column, infantry front, light vehicles behind, not full speed. They're cautious." Alexei nodded. "How far?" 200, maybe 300 meters from our trap." The lieutenant signaled the scout to stay low and wait. He knew that at any moment, one nervous shot, one shouted order, could ruin everything. He exhaled slowly. His breath rose in a thin cloud and vanished in the darkness. Then he picked up the flute. This time, when he lifted it to his lips, even his closest men felt a strange tension. They had heard him play before, in trenches, in moments of rare quiet. But this was different. Now, every note mattered. The first notes were almost invisible in the night. 2 short, low tones, played softly but clearly, in quick succession. To an outsider, it might have sounded like a shepherd testing his pipe somewhere in the forest. To the trained squad leaders on both flanks, it was unmistakable. Halt. Hold position. Do not move. Do not open fire. The The patterns traveled through the trees, reached hidden ears, and converted into gestures. In one foxhole, a sergeant squeezed a young soldier's shoulder, silently signaling him to stay completely still. On the right flank, another NCO pressed his palm downward, indicating, "Down, no noise." The company froze. German voices grew louder. Now they could hear individual words, orders to maintain interval, instructions to stay off the open road and use the forest cover. The enemy officers were not fools. They expected danger. But they did not know that the danger was already shaped around them. The head of the German column entered the mouth of the planned horseshoe. Dark figures, rifles slung, some with hands on the straps of their packs, others holding submachine guns. They stepped around stumps and fallen branches, boots making muffled thuds. Behind them, a small half-track rumbled slowly, followed by more infantry. The column began to stretch, adapting to the irregular ground. From his vantage point, Sokolov saw shadows moving like a black river between trees. He knew the plan. Let them in deeper. Let them commit. Wait until their front elements passed the center, leaving their flanks exposed to fire from both sides. But without radio or wires, how would the other flank know exactly when the Germans had reached the critical point? The answer lay in his hands. He waited until he could distinguish the outlines of helmets, until he saw one German soldier casually adjust his scarf, another wipe his nose. When the nearest figures were almost in line with the concealed center scouts, Sokolov raised the flute again. This time he played one high note, a small pause, then another high note. Advance quietly. Not for the whole company, they were already in position, but for select elements, the scouts in the very center, tasked with slipping behind the leading German squads once they passed. In the darkness, those scouts heard the signal, recognized it, and moved like shadows. They slid from tree to tree, from depression to depression, not running, not rushing, but flowing into the gaps between German units. The German column had no idea that slim, hard shapes were now behind them, preparing to cut off their exit. In the right flank position, a young officer wiped sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand, even though the air was freezing. He heard the pattern and signaled his men. "Stay ready. Wait." Every muscle in the Soviet line burned with tension. Fingers rested on triggers. Grenades were already in hands. Machine gunners kept their sights loosely on the dark mass of enemy shapes. One accidental cough, one poor movement, and dozens of German flashlights and guns would swing toward them. Sokolov listened, not just with his ears, but with his entire body. He felt the vibration of their steps through the frozen ground. He measured distance in his mind, translating it into meters, angles, and fields of fire. The head of the column now was close to the exit of their trap, but not yet past the invisible threshold. If they attacked too early, the Germans could withdraw or scatter. If they waited too long, the front elements would burst out into more open terrain and escape. There was a narrow window, perhaps only 10 or 20 seconds, in which the column would be sufficiently deep and sufficiently committed that retreat would turn into chaos. That moment came when he saw the half-track. It crawled into the clearing like a metal animal, its engine growling softly, exhaust steaming in the cold air. Infantry moved around it in a loose screen. At that point, enough of the column was inside the forest pocket. In the center, scouts had already taken cover behind trunks that would now become killing posts. All that was left was to unify the company into a single, deadly action. Sokolov raised the flute for the third time. 3 notes now. A descending sequence, high, then medium, then low. Prepare to fire. The sound cut through branches and darkness. It reached men who could see nothing but vague shapes in snow. In one hole, a sniper adjusted his scope, setting his aim on where he expected German officers to be. In another, a machine gunner tightened his grip, feeding belt into the weapon. On the right flank, the platoon sergeant whispered, "That's it, boys. Safety off. First volley on my mark." The Germans kept moving, unaware that around them, dozens of rifle barrels were locking in place. Then, finally, came the last command, the one that would spring the trap. Sokolov inhaled once, steady and controlled. He knew that this sequence could not be played twice. If anything went wrong now, there would be no room to correct or clarify. 3 rapidly rising notes, sharp and cutting, low, medium, high. The signal to unleash everything. For less than a second, The forest heard only the tail of the last note. Then, the night exploded. From the left flank, a wall of gunfire erupted. Rifles spit flame. Automatic weapons roared. From the right flank, another wave joined, crossing it in a deadly lattice. The first ranks of the German column had no time to react. Men fell where they stood, torn by bullets from both sides. Shouts of confusion and pain cut through the night. From the center, hidden scouts opened fire into the backs and flanks of the stunned enemy. Some tossed grenades into clusters of helmets. Others picked targets methodically, aiming for NCOs and anyone giving orders. The half-track at the column's core tried to turn its gun toward one flank, but before it could, an anti-tank rifle team, placed carefully by Sokolov before the operation, fired at its vulnerable spots. The metal beast jerked, its engine sputtering, then a grenade flew under its tracks, finishing it in a burst of fire and smoke. German soldiers dove for cover, but there was little cover to be had. They tried to spread out, but every direction led into overlapping fields of fire. From somewhere in the rear, an officer shouted for them to push forward, to break through. But as they advanced, they only plunged deeper into the pocket, straight into Soviet lines ready to cut them down. Panicked, others tried to retreat back through the forest the way they had come. But by then, the mortar crews, waiting for their own auditory cue, had heard the continuous rattle of small arms and unleashed their bombs. Mortar shells fell on the rear elements of the column, smashing attempts at organized withdrawal. Trees splintered, snow and earth flew into the air. The forest became a blender of wood, metal, and flesh. For the next minutes, there was no music. Only the harsh mechanical rhythm of war, bursts, screams, detonations, shouted commands. In the chaos, no one remembered the flute, but its echoes were present in the exact synchronicity of the attack. On the right flank, the sergeant who had once called the lieutenant crazy now saw how perfectly their fire intersected with the other side. There was no dangerous gap, no premature firing, no late reaction. He fired a burst, ducked, then shouted to his men, "Keep it tight! They're stuck! They're in the bag!" On the left flank, Sokolov moved from position to position, checking lines, shifting small groups as needed. Once, when he saw a part of his flank start to drift too far forward, risking exposure, he grabbed the flute again, lifted it amid the gunfire, and forced out the two low notes: halt, hold. His immediate men heard it, recognized it, and raised fists, stopping others from rushing blindly. A German MG team tried to set up a position behind a stump, attempting to suppress the left Soviet flank. Before they could stabilize their weapon, one of Sokolov's riflemen, guided by the lieutenant's quickly shouted correction, shot the gunner. The machine gun fell silent. Minutes felt like hours. Bodies fell and piled. Smoke rolled low across the ground, mixed with steam from the warm blood hitting cold air. Eventually, the intensity of the German fire faltered. Ammunition ran low. Officers were down. NCOs were dead or scattered. The battalion, caught off guard and then ground from three sides, began to fracture. Some small groups raised hands and shouted that they surrendered. Others tried to crawl away individually, only to be pinned by snipers and scattered fire. The Soviet company, still under the captain's broader control but guided in the micro by Sokolov's prearranged signals, tightened the noose. They did not chase. They did not overextend. They held positions and methodically neutralized any organized resistance. At one point, Captain Grigoriev finally reached Sokolov's position, his coat torn, face blackened with soot. "What's your status?" he shouted over the dying crackle of sporadic shots. Sokolov replied, breathing heavily. "Left flank holding, right flank in place. Center scouts are alive. The column is broken, Comrade Captain. We have prisoners." The captain looked at the forest floor, now strewn with enemy bodies and discarded weapons, then at his own line, still largely intact. "How did you keep them together without radio?" he asked, almost more to himself than to Sokolov. The young lieutenant, in answer, simply raised the flute slightly, its wooden surface smeared with mud and sweat. Grigoriev let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You and that stupid toy," he said. "You turned a battalion into target practice." The outcome was clear by dawn. German forces that had tried to use that corridor were decimated. Survivors were either prisoners or scattered groups with no cohesion. The road to the rear remained in Soviet hands, giving precious time for reinforcements and supplies to move. When the sun finally pushed gray light through the tree branches, men emerged from their positions, stiff, exhausted, but alive. Some collected weapons and ammunition from the dead. Others led prisoners to the rear. Word spread quickly. "Did you hear? We trapped them like cattle in a pen." Not a single radio order, they said. It all went by some kind of code. It was the lieutenant, the musician. He played signals, they say. The jokes changed flavor. No longer the idiot with the toy, but the one whose melody killed more Germans than most artillery barrages. In the following days, a divisional officer came to the company's new positions to gather reports. He listened to Captain Grigoriev's account, occasionally glancing at Sokolov, who stood quietly at the side. "You're telling me," the staff officer said, "that you coordinated a three-sided ambush in a dark forest with broken communications by using a children's flute?" The captain looked him straight in the eye. "I'm telling you that our radios died, our wires snapped, our flares would have given away positions. And this lieutenant's improvised signaling scheme saved my company and destroyed an enemy battalion's advance element. You can call his instrument whatever you like." The officer, torn between skepticism and the undeniable numbers, finally asked Sokolov, "Where did you learn this system?" Sokolov answered simply, "Nowhere. We tested what we had. Sound carries when machines fail." Later, among his own men, the same rough sergeant who had once doubted him approached with an awkward grin. "So, Comrade Lieutenant," he began, scratching his neck, "I suppose we should all start learning your songs, eh?" Sokolov shook his head. "They're not songs," he said. "They're just signals. Tools." The sergeant gave a half snort, half laugh. "Call them what you want. Last night, that tool played like a machine gun." In the weeks that followed, other units heard of the battle. Some officers mocked the idea. Others secretly experimented with their own versions of simple sonic codes. Whistles, horn patterns, anything that could act as backup when technology failed. But for the men of Captain Grigoriev's company, one image stayed forever. The sight of a young lieutenant in a dark forest, surrounded by enemy forces and broken equipment, lifting a simple wooden flute to his lips, and turning 3 short sequences of notes into a perfectly timed, deadly trap. They had once called him a romantic, a dreamer, a musician out of place in war. After that night, they called him something else, the lieutenant whose melody closed the bag on a German battalion. And somewhere, in the quiet moments between battles, when the front calmed and the guns went silent for a brief hour, the men would hear that familiar wooden flute again. Not as a signal, not as a code, but as a low, simple tune drifting over the trenches. It no longer sounded like a toy. It sounded like survival.